Millionaire married his poor maid for a deal, but everyone gasped when she walked down the aisle. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let us return to our main character. Ethan Walker was a man who had everything people dream of: wealth, power, and a name that commanded attention in New York City's business world. Yet behind the tall glass walls of his office, his empire was beginning to crack. The board demanded that he present a stable family image before finalizing a merger worth hundreds of millions. And to make matters worse, his mother's heart condition was worsening every day. He did not believe in love. To him, feelings were just distractions, and relationships were liabilities. That night, as rain poured against the windows of his penthouse, Ethan stared at the contract his lawyer had drafted. It was simple, a marriage agreement for 6 months, purely legal, to calm the investors and silence the gossip. All he needed was a bride who would not complicate his life. Downstairs, in the same house, Clara Reyes worked quietly, dusting the marble staircase. She was 26, a maid who had been cleaning the Walker estate for almost a year. She was small, graceful, and always polite. Few people even noticed her except for the old housekeeper who often said, "That girl carries more dignity in her silence than most people in this house." That evening, Ethan called Clara into his study. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and heavy. She stood near the door, her uniform still damp from cleaning the garden terrace. "You wanted to see me, sir?" she asked softly. Ethan looked up, his tone flat and precise. "Clara, I'm going to make you an offer. It may sound strange, but I need you to listen before you say anything." She frowned slightly, unsure if she had done something wrong. "Yes, sir." He leaned back in his chair, his hands folded. "I need a wife. Not for love, not for romance, but for a contract. 6 months only. You will receive financial security, medical coverage for your mother's treatment, and enough money to start your own business afterward." Clara blinked, unable to hide her confusion. "You mean a fake marriage?" Ethan nodded once. "You will not be expected to share a room, attend only the events I choose, and never discuss this with anyone. It is a deal, nothing more." For a moment, silence filled the room. Clara's heart pounded as she stared at him, trying to read his face. "Why me?" she finally asked. His answer was cold. "Because you are simple, discreet, and you do not ask questions. You need the money. I need an image. We can both benefit." Clara lowered her eyes. The thought of such a proposal felt humiliating, but then she remembered her mother lying in the small apartment across town, her medicine bottles half empty. The hospital had called again that morning, warning that the bills were overdue. Ethan's voice broke her thoughts. "I will give you until tomorrow to decide. If you agree, the wedding will be small and private. My lawyer will handle the paperwork." When she left his office, the night air felt colder than before. She walked past the mirror in the hallway and caught her reflection plain, tired, and ordinary. Yet somewhere deep inside, a spark of defiance burned. By dawn, Clara returned to his study, her hands trembling but her voice steady. "I will do it, Mr. Walker," she said. "But on one condition: you will treat me with respect, even if it is only for a contract." For the first time, Ethan looked at her differently. There was something in her tone, a quiet strength he did not expect. He nodded slowly. "Agreed." And with that, the deal was made. 2 signatures on a paper bound 2 very different worlds together. Outside, the sun rose over Manhattan, unaware that somewhere in a glass tower, a contract marriage had just begun, a deal that would soon challenge everything Ethan Walker thought he knew about dignity, love, and truth. The wedding was nothing like the stories Clara had imagined as a little girl. There were no flowers she had chosen, no laughter from friends, no music that carried meaning. Only flashbulbs, whispers, and the silent hum of power filling the air. Ethan's assistant had arranged everything in less than a week. It was meant to look perfect, not feel perfect. When Clara entered the grand hall, her heart raced beneath the plain ivory gown they had altered to fit her. The dress was beautiful in a quiet way, though she felt out of place among the crystal chandeliers and the designer suits. She could feel the weight of eyes, people judging her, measuring her worth against the man waiting at the altar. Ethan stood tall, dressed in his charcoal gray suit, expression unreadable. He looked at her as though she were part of a business deal, a necessary formality. But then something happened that no one expected. The old wedding planner whispered to Clara, "Dear, the wheelchair is ready." Gesturing toward the side aisle, Clara froze. She had never mentioned it to Ethan, but the accident from her teenage years had left her walking slower, her right leg weaker. Normally, long distances required support, but today something inside her rebelled against that image. She took a deep breath. "No," she said softly. "I will walk." The pianist began to play. Murmurs rippled through the guests as Clara took her first step down the long aisle. The sound of her heels echoed in the marble hall. Step by step, she held her balance, eyes fixed forward. Ethan's composure wavered for the first time. The whispers turned to gasps. By the time she reached him, the hall had fallen into complete silence. Her breathing was uneven, but her voice was calm when she looked up at him. "I told you I would stand with dignity, Mr. Walker." Ethan said nothing. For a fleeting second, something human flickered in his eyes. Then he turned slightly toward the officiant. "Let us begin." The ceremony was brief. No vows of love, only the exchange of rings and signatures. As the officiant declared them husband and wife, camera flashes erupted like small explosions. Clara's fingers trembled slightly when Ethan took her hand. It was a cold touch, rehearsed and careful. After the ceremony, a limousine carried them to his penthouse, the city lights flickering against the windows. Clara sat quietly beside him, her bouquet resting on her lap. The air between them was heavy with unspoken thoughts. When they arrived, Ethan gestured toward the guest wing. "Your room is down the hall. I have meetings tomorrow morning, so keep your schedule flexible. We will need to attend a charity dinner next week." She nodded without a word and carried her small suitcase down the corridor. The room was larger than her entire apartment. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Hudson River. Everything was immaculate, soulless, expensive, perfect. That night, Clara stood by the window, still wearing her wedding dress. The city stretched endlessly before her, its lights like 1,000 indifferent stars. She whispered to herself, "You made your choice, Clara. You will finish what you started." In another room, Ethan loosened his tie and poured himself a glass of whiskey. He stared at the city too, though from a very different perspective. To him, the marriage was a wall, a shield to protect his empire from the wolves of the media. Yet, for reasons he could not name, her voice at the altar kept echoing in his head. "I told you I would stand with dignity." The following morning, the newspapers exploded with headlines. "Maid marries millionaire, a fairy tale or a business move." Ethan's assistant stormed into his office. "Sir, this could backfire. People are questioning your motives." Ethan's tone remained calm. "Let them talk. Controversy drives attention. Investors love attention." Emser. But by the third day, he noticed something he had not expected. Every time Clara appeared beside him at public events, the cameras lingered on her, not because of scandal, but because of the quiet grace she carried. She did not smile for show, nor did she flinch when reporters shouted insults. She simply stood there, steady, composed, her chin lifted ever so slightly. One evening, after a charity dinner, as they stepped back into the limousine, Ethan glanced at her. "You are handling this circus better than I imagined." Clara looked out the window, her voice calm. "I have been judged all my life, Mr. Walker. This is nothing new." He studied her reflection in the glass. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar, a trace of guilt. When they reached home, Clara paused at her door. "Good night," she said quietly. Ethan replied, "Good night, Mrs. Walker." The title hung in the air between them, sharp and strange. As the door closed, he stood for a moment in the silent hallway, unsure why the sound of her heels fading down the corridor stayed with him long after she was gone. Somewhere deep inside, beneath years of arrogance and control, a crack had begun to form, one he could neither ignore nor repair. And though Ethan Walker did not yet understand it, that tiny fracture was where love would eventually find its way in. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of their contract marriage settled into something that looked calm from the outside, but felt cold on the inside. Ethan and Clara played their roles perfectly before the public attending charity dinners, posing for photographs and walking arm in arm through events filled with people who whispered behind crystal glasses. But when the cameras were gone, silence filled the vast penthouse like a fog that never lifted. Clara spent most of her mornings caring for Ethan's mother, who had recently moved back into the house, Mrs. Walker was frail, confined to her bed after a minor stroke, but she had sharp eyes and a kinder heart than her son. "You remind me of my late husband," she said one day, smiling faintly. "Not because of how you look, but because you carry storms behind quiet eyes." Clara smiled softly. "Maybe I'm just learning how to survive them, ma'am." "Oh." Ethan often left for meetings before sunrise, his suit pressed, his voice clipped, his thoughts buried under endless reports. Yet he began to notice small traces of Clara everywhere. Flowers she placed in the dining room, books neatly arranged in the library, or the faint sound of her humming in the garden below. He never mentioned it, but each time he caught those glimpses, his chest tightened for reasons he could not explain. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Ethan returned home earlier than usual. He found Clara in the kitchen, helping Mrs. Walker paint small ceramic figures for therapy. There was paint on her hands and a lightness in her laugh that he had never heard before. For a moment, he stood in the doorway, watching silently. The woman he had married out of convenience looked nothing like the quiet maid he remembered. She was alive, gentle, confident, radiant. When she noticed him, she stood quickly. "Mr. Walker, you are home early." He nodded, his voice even. The meeting ended sooner than expected. His eyes flicked to the colors on her fingers. "You paint?" She hesitated, then smiled. "It helps your mother relax. She asked me to join." His mother chuckled softly. "Do not look so surprised, Ethan. Your wife has more patience than you ever did." That word wife sounded strange, heavier than usual. He said nothing, just turned toward the window. Later that night, Ethan sat in his study reviewing market projections, but his focus broke when he saw Clara's reflection passing by the glass door. She was carrying a tray of tea for Mrs. Walker, her movements careful but steady. There was no trace of greed or pretense in her, only quiet strength. He looked down at the contract on his desk, the one that defined their arrangement. For the first time, it felt like a chain instead of protection. The next morning, he found Clara in the garden. She was kneeling beside a row of white lilies, trimming them with precise hands. He stood behind her for a moment before speaking. "Why do you still do this work? You could rest. You have more than enough help here." Without looking up, she replied, "Because work keeps me human, Mr. Walker. Money does not." He studied her profile, the morning light soft on her face. "You speak as if you hate everything I stand for." She looked at him then, her voice calm but firm. "I do not hate you, sir. I just think you have forgotten what truly matters." Her words struck deeper than she intended. He turned away, pretending to check his watch. "We have a dinner tonight. The investors will expect you there. Wear something elegant." That night, under the golden chandeliers of a five-star hotel, Ethan noticed the way Clara carried herself with quiet confidence despite the stare. She did not flinch when a socialite sneered. "She cleans up well, does she not?" Instead, she met the woman's gaze and said softly, "Cleanliness is something I know very well, madam." The table went silent. Ethan felt an unexpected flicker of pride. When they returned home, he walked her to her door. For the first time, he said her name without formality. "Good night, Clara." She turned slightly, her voice soft. "Good night, Ethan." The sound of it, his name on her lips, stayed with him long after she closed the door. Days later, Clara received a letter from the hospital. Her mother's condition had worsened, and she needed to visit immediately. She asked Ethan for a few days away. He approved without hesitation, but when she left, the house felt painfully empty. The echo of her presence lingered in every room, and Ethan realized how accustomed he had become to hearing her voice, her footsteps, even her quiet hum at dawn. When she returned, exhausted but relieved that her mother was stable, she found a vase of fresh lilies waiting in her room with a note that simply read, "For the woman who reminds me what being human means, E.W." Clara smiled faintly, touched but uncertain. She placed the note inside the drawer with the contract, unsure which of the two would last longer. Outside, the city lights shimmered against the night sky. Somewhere between the lines of a legal agreement, something unspoken had begun to bloom, fragile, quiet, and real. But neither Ethan nor Clara was ready to admit that what had started as a deal was slowly becoming something that neither of them could control. For a while, life inside the Walker mansion moved quietly, almost peacefully. The tabloids had grown bored of their story. Investors were satisfied, and Ethan began to lower his guard. He even started joining Clara and his mother for dinner, though he rarely said much. Sometimes he caught himself watching her laugh with his mother and wondered when her presence had stopped feeling like an inconvenience. But peace never lasted long in Ethan's world. One Monday morning, his assistant burst into the office, pale and breathless. "Sir, you need to see this." He placed a tabloid magazine on the desk. Across the front page, the headline screamed, "Contract Bride. Documents leak from inside Walker Industries." Ethan's stomach dropped. Below the headline was a grainy photo of the marriage contract, his signature, her name, the terms of their deal. It was the exact document he had locked in his private drawer. "Where did this come from?" Ethan demanded. "Someone from the board, maybe Daniel," the assistant said carefully. "He has been trying to undermine you for months." Ethan clenched his jaw. Daniel Reeves, his former partner, had always envied him, but this was lower than he expected. By evening, the news had spread everywhere. Reporters gathered outside the mansion, cameras flashing as they shouted questions. "Mr. Walker, is it true you paid your wife to marry you?" "Mrs. Walker, how much did you earn for the deal?" Clara stood by the window, watching the chaos unfold at the gates. Her hands trembled. Ethan entered the room, his phone ringing nonstop. "Clara, I am handling this," he said. She turned to him, her voice steady but wounded. "Handling this? You mean denying it?" "I will fix it," he said. "I just need time." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes glistening. "Time is what I gave you, Ethan. Respect is what you promised me. Tell me, which one is left?" He had no answer. The next morning, the mansion was silent. Ethan woke to find her room empty. On the desk lay her wedding ring and a folded piece of paper. Her handwriting was simple and calm. "I will not live as a transaction. I hope one day you learn that truth cannot be bought." Outside, the media frenzy continued, but the house felt hollow. Ethan sat alone in the study, staring at the torn edges of the leaked contract on his desk. The words that once protected him now burned like shame in his chest. Daniel's betrayal had cost him more than his reputation. It had cost him the only person who had ever looked at him without fear or calculation. As the sun set beyond the skyline, Ethan poured himself a glass of whiskey he could not bring himself to drink. For the first time in years, the silence in his home was not peaceful. It was punishment. He whispered into the empty room, "Clara, I was wrong." But only the echo of his own voice answered back. Days turned into weeks, and the world kept spinning while Ethan Walker's once untouchable empire began to tremble. The board questioned his leadership, investors pulled their confidence, and the media branded him a fraud. But none of that compared to the emptiness he felt without Clara in the house. Every hallway echoed with memories of her quiet presence, the soft hum of her voice, the scent of lilies she used to arrange in the living room. Now it was just silence, cold and unforgiving. One afternoon, while reviewing reports he could barely focus on, Ethan's mother entered his office in her wheelchair. Her expression was gentle but firm. "Ethan, I may be old, but I am not blind," she said. "You are losing yourself, chasing numbers and pride. You lost a good woman because you were too afraid to feel." Ethan's voice was low. "It is too late for that, Mother." She reached out and placed a wrinkled hand over his. "If it were too late, she would not still wear your ring on a chain around her neck." He looked up sharply. "You saw her?" Mrs. Walker nodded. "She came to visit me at the clinic 2 days ago. She looked tired but strong. She is teaching art therapy to children with disabilities at the community center downtown. She told me she hopes you find peace." That night, Ethan sat alone in his car outside the community center. Through the glass doors, he could see Clara surrounded by children holding paintbrushes, their faces lit with laughter. She moved from table to table, guiding small hands, her own face calm and radiant. He watched silently, realizing that even in pain, she was still giving, still healing others while he hid behind guilt. When she stepped outside to lock the doors, she froze at the sight of him. "Ethan," she said softly, surprised. He stepped closer, his voice rough with hesitation. "I needed to see you, not as part of a deal, not to ask for anything." She folded her arms, guarded but not unkind. "Why now?" He exhaled. "Because I finally understand what I destroyed. I let silence speak for me when truth was what you deserved. I thought I could buy respect, but you showed me it can only be earned." Clara looked at him, her eyes glimmering under the streetlight. "You cannot fix this with apologies, Ethan." "I know," he said, "but I can start with honesty. I will tell the world everything, every lie, every reason, every truth you deserve to hear." She searched his face for a long moment. "If you do that, they will tear you apart." He nodded slowly. "Maybe, but this time I will stand for something real." The night breeze moved gently between them, carrying the faint scent of paint and rain. For the first time, Ethan smiled, not the polished smile of a businessman, but the quiet, human smile of a man finally willing to fall and rise again. As Clara turned to leave, she paused, her voice soft but steady. "If you mean it, Ethan, then do it. Not for me, for yourself." He watched her walk away, her figure fading into the glow of the city lights. And in that moment, Ethan knew that tomorrow would not be about redemption in headlines, but redemption in truth. The next morning, headlines across the city carried a new announcement. Ethan Walker calls for emergency press conference. The entire business world braced for a statement that could either destroy or redeem him. Ethan spent the morning in silence, sitting in his study, the marriage contract lying torn on the desk beside a single white lily Clara had left behind months ago. He stared at it for a long time, then folded the pieces neatly and placed them into an envelope marked, "No more lies." When noon arrived, the press room was already full. Reporters packed the aisles, cameras flashing as Ethan stepped to the podium. His hair was slightly disheveled, his face pale but composed. He looked nothing like the cold businessman the world once knew. He adjusted the microphone and spoke in a voice that carried steady sincerity. "I have spent my life building walls around myself," he began. "Walls made of pride, money, and control. I believed I could buy everything: success, peace, even respect, but I was wrong." The room fell silent. 6 months ago, I entered into a marriage contract with a woman named Clara Reyes. It was supposed to be an arrangement, a performance for investors, a shield for my reputation. But somewhere along the way, she became the only truth I had left. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Ethan continued, unflinching. "I broke her trust. I treated her with arrogance and fear instead of honesty. And when the world judged her, I stayed silent to protect my image. That silence was my greatest failure." "Ugh!" one reporter shouted. "Are you saying the marriage was fake?" Ethan met their eyes. "No, it started as a deal, but it became real because she was real. She showed me that dignity does not depend on status, and love cannot be bought." Flashes exploded across the room. The board of directors sat stiffly at the back, their faces unreadable. But Ethan no longer cared. "If my reputation ends today, let it end on truth, because I would rather lose everything than live one more day behind a lie." He stepped away from the podium and walked out into the bright afternoon light. Cameras followed him, reporters shouted his name, but he heard none of it. The noise faded into something distant and unimportant. Hours later, the press coverage spread everywhere. Social media exploded. Some mocked him, others praised his courage, but among the millions of voices, there was only one that mattered to him. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Clara watched the broadcast replay on a small television in the Art Center lounge. Paint-stained children sat around her, their curious eyes glued to the screen. When Ethan's words echoed through the speakers, she became the only truth I had left. Her breath caught. The children cheered, not fully understanding the weight of his confession, but sensing the goodness in it. Clara smiled faintly, tears glimmering in her eyes. He finally spoke, she whispered to herself. Outside, the city glowed in the twilight. Somewhere out there, a man who once lived behind walls had finally learned to stand without them. And though they were still apart, something in Clara's heart began to shift like a door unlocking quietly after years of being closed. Weeks later, the noise around Ethan's confession began to fade. The city that once mocked him had moved on to new scandals, new names, new stories. But for Ethan Walker, the silence that followed was not emptiness, it was clarity. He sold one of his properties, stepped away from corporate control, and began spending time where his heart had found its first hint of truth, the Community Art Center. He started visiting quietly, helping with donations, repairing the old roof, even painting benches for the children. Clara watched from a distance at first, cautious but curious. He never imposed, never asked for attention. He simply showed up, day after day, with sleeves rolled up and humility replacing the arrogance that used to follow him everywhere. One afternoon, Clara found him kneeling beside a young girl, teaching her how to mix colors on a palette. His white shirt was stained with blue and yellow paint, his expression soft. When he looked up and saw her watching, he smiled a genuine smile, free of the polish and pride that once defined him. "I did not know you could paint," she said, crossing her arms, though her voice carried warmth. "I did not either," he replied, his eyes gentle. "But it feels good to build something that does not depend on money." She nodded, sitting beside him. The air between them was peaceful, filled only with the sounds of children laughing and brushes gliding over paper. After a while, she said quietly, "People will forget the scandal soon. You could rebuild your company." He shook his head. "Let them rebuild it without me. I am done pretending. For the first time, I am doing something that matters." That evening, the center hosted a small charity event for the children's art exhibition. Guests from the neighborhood gathered, filling the room with gentle chatter and music. Clara walked in wearing a simple pale blue dress, her hair loose and glowing under the warm lights. Ethan stood near the entrance, his eyes following her with quiet admiration. When it was time for the closing speech, the director of the center called Ethan forward unexpectedly. "Mr. Walker, would you like to say a few words?" He froze for a moment, caught off guard, then looked toward Clara. She gave a small nod. Taking a breath, he stepped to the microphone. "I once believed that value came from numbers, from success, power, and reputation. But I was wrong. The most valuable thing any of us can give is honesty, and sometimes it takes losing everything to understand that." The audience applauded softly. Clara felt her chest tighten with pride she had not expected to feel again. After the event, Ethan approached her quietly. "Clara," he said, his voice low, "there is something I have been meaning to ask." She tilted her head, waiting. "I know I do not deserve another chance, but I would like to create something real with you. Not a contract, not a deal, just us." He paused. "Will you come with me tomorrow?" "Where?" she asked softly. He smiled. "You will see." The next morning, he drove her to the small chapel near the river, the same place where they had once stood under the harsh lights of cameras and reporters. This time, the doors were closed to the world. Inside, only sunlight streamed through the stained glass, casting colors over the empty pews. Ethan took her hand, his voice steady but trembling with emotion. "The first time I stood here, I made a deal. Today, I make a promise." He reached into his pocket and produced the same ring she had once returned. No lies, no contracts, only commitment. Tears welled in Clara's eyes as he placed the ring back on her finger, and when she whispered, "Yes," it was not just a word, it was the closing of an old wound and the beginning of something whole. Outside, the wind carried the sound of church bells, soft and pure, marking not a ceremony of convenience, but a marriage finally made of truth. Years passed, and the memory of the scandal that once shook the city became nothing more than a faint whisper in time. Ethan and Clara Walker built a life far from the noise of the business world. They turned the Community Arts Center into something greater, a foundation dedicated to helping children with disabilities find confidence through creativity. The Clara Reyes Foundation, named after Clara's mother and Ethan's late father, became a place where broken hearts learned to heal and forgotten dreams found color again. Every morning, Ethan walked through the center's courtyard with a cup of coffee in hand, greeting the teachers, the children, and the volunteers. His once sharp business attire had been replaced by rolled-up sleeves and paint-splattered jeans. He had traded skyscrapers for sunlight, and he had never looked back. Inside one of the studios, Clara was guiding a group of students through a mural project. The wall was covered with bright shapes and words painted by little hands. At the center of it all, in bold colors, were two simple words: "Love heals." When Ethan entered, the children immediately ran to him, showing off their artwork. He laughed a deep, unguarded sound that filled the room with warmth. Clara turned toward him, smiling. "You are late again," she teased. "I was fixing the ramp outside," he said, still smiling. "And I brought something for the final touch." He handed her a small, framed photo of their wedding at the chapel, the one without reporters, without contracts, only sunlight and truth. Clara took it carefully, her voice soft. "We have come a long way, Ethan." He looked around the room at the children painting, their laughter echoing like music. "We have," he said quietly. "You saved me, Clara. You showed me what it means to build something that lasts." She shook her head gently. "No, we saved each other." As the afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, Ethan and Clara stood side by side, watching the children finish the mural. When the last stroke of paint was placed, one of the boys looked up and asked, "Mr. Walker, what does love heals mean?" Ethan smiled, his eyes soft. "It means that love is not just a feeling, it is something you do. It is the way you forgive, the way you care, the way you choose truth even when it costs you everything." The boy nodded thoughtfully and went back to painting. Clara reached for Ethan's hand. "I think your speech worked," she whispered. He laughed quietly. "It only took me a few years to learn it." As the sun dipped below the skyline, they stepped outside together. The courtyard glowed golden in the fading light. The mural shimmered behind them, a tapestry of hope, color, and second chances. Ethan wrapped his arm gently around Clara's shoulders. "You know," he said softly, "I once married you for a deal." Clara looked up at him with a playful smile. "And how did that deal turn out?" He leaned closer, his voice tender. "It turned into forever." The camera of life would have ended there on that final image of two souls who had found redemption not in wealth or power, but in love that had been tested and proven real. And as the last light of day touched their faces, a quiet truth lingered in the air, the same one Clara had carried from the beginning. Love does not need to be perfect, it only needs to be true.